With the Hartford Foundation's Nonprofit Support Program. And I want to welcome you all to today's session on scenario planning. We hope that you're all doing well, staying healthy, and we're looking forward to seeing everyone in person, hopefully sometime in the near future. So one thing we've learned over the past year is that Zoom sessions are a team sport. So as always, a very special thank you to my terrific NSP colleagues, Monica Kelly and Betsy Johnson, for all of their behind the scenes assistance and just great teamwork in planning for and managing the logistics for today's session. And since it's a question that always comes up, we will be sharing the session recording as well as the slides and the handouts with all of you following today's session. Betsy will also be posting the survey for this session in the chat towards the end, and she will also be sending you the survey immediately following the session. It is the only price of admission, and we really do value your feedback and read all of your comments. So please do take a few minutes to complete the survey after the session. Our presenter today will be pausing at several points throughout the session this morning, and we are a small but mighty crew this morning. So the good news is that more chance for you all to ask questions. So please use the chat to enter your questions, and then I'll be feeding those to our presenter. Also, a little bit of a bonus for all of you is that our presenter will be sticking around immediately following today's session for what we call after class time. So if there are questions that we can't get to during the session or that you would rather ask in a small and more intimate setting, you can stick around after the session and ask those questions. So I'm delighted that our presenter today is Julie Koo, who is Vice President at TDC in Boston, which is itself a nonprofit. Julie has worked with the Hartford Foundation in the past, and among other things, she led the arts landscape study for us a couple of years ago. Julie helps her clients to align their missions with the realities of their operating environments, and her specialties, among others, include strategic business planning, program evaluation, and organizational development. So with that, welcome, Julie. The program is all yours. You're on mute, Julie.
Hi, I am organizing my screens here to share. Okay. So can you see my screen? Great. Okay, thank you so much for coming to hear me talk. It's one of my least favorite things to do, so I'm pleased that you're interested in doing that today. So just somehow my slides got advanced. Okay, so what will we be covering today? We'll be talking first about some just housekeeping things about expectations for the session and dealing with the tech. We'll do some introductions of myself and you guys. Then we'll talk a bit about the current kind of crazy context that we're living through right now. And then talk about the main event, scenario planning, and how to kind of make decisions during a time of uncertainty, and then finally talk a bit about the hidden opportunities that's at hand now. In terms of our session today, if you could please be prepared to stay on mute during the presentation and use the chat to ask questions or make comments throughout the presentation. Meryl will be monitoring those things and raising her hand in case there's something that needs clarification during the session. We're going to be prepared to answer some polls. We're going to be doing a little interactivity at the beginning of the session. And I will, as Mayor said, pause to take clarifying questions at the end of sections. But I will be kind of deferring meatier questions till the Q&A session, which will be approximately 10-15 minutes at the end. And then finally, as Mayor said, I'll be staying online for 15 minutes for some after class time. All right, so introductions. So me, My name is Julie Koo. I'm a vice president at TDC. We're a nonprofit organization that offers consulting and research services to the nonprofit sector. In terms of my particular practice, right now I'm working with a number of BIPOC arts organizations, and I also, for their planning, and I also from time to time, as Mayor said, do arts sector research. So the arts are my specialty, although TDC does work across the sector. Polls, so you, first poll, so we wanted to understand kind of what positions that people are holding in your organization. So Monica, if you could start the poll. Great. So I'll keep the poll open for another couple of seconds. Okay, last 2 seconds, and awesome. So it looks like we've got a pretty, a super majority of executive directors here, so great. You are often the leaders of planning, so that kind of makes sense. Okay, so our next question. So what subsector do you work within? So Monica, if you could start the poll for this. Okay, and last couple of seconds. Great, I'm ending the poll, and it looks like we've got a majority, or the largest group is from human services, and then we have a good showing, a third from the arts, and then we've got education and children's services and housing and some other. Great, this is good. So I've got a mix of, it's a case, my case today is mostly focused on kids in the arts. So, and if you call childcare human services, and I've got some childcare in there as well. All right. And budget size is my last question for introductions for you. So Monica, if you could start this poll. And we'll keep it open for another couple of seconds. Okay. And last 2 seconds. Great. So, so we've got about half of folks in attendance are running organizations with budgets over $1 million, and we've got kind of a graduated step down from under 250 to 250 to 500 to kind of the mid-sized. Great. Okay. Okay, so I'm pleased because it looks like the case that I'm doing today is somewhat relevant to you guys, so that's great. All right, so let's talk about the current context. I know it has been a lot for everyone. Well, the first thing I'll share is I did take a look at a survey that was done by the Alliance. It was published in September of 2020, and it looked at 250 statewide nonprofits administered in June. So this is a little old information, but I thought it might be a nice kind of table setter for what we've all just been through and are still working through the aftermath of. So my first question for you is around financial issues. So Monica, if you could start this poll. You know, people have gone through a variety of financial issues during the pandemic. and some good, some bad. So very interested to see how you guys have been getting through financially. And if you answer other, please feel free to put into the chat what your financial issues have been.
And Julie, people can select more than one here, right?
I believe so.
Yeah.
No, it's not true.
No?
They're shaking
Oh,
their
okay.
heads. So I think we set it up as
Okay.
just one.
Gotcha.
So I guess choose the one that's just been the most impactful for you. Okay, I'll leave it open for another couple of seconds. And do use the chat if you have other issues that you'd like to share about financials. Okay, and the polling. So it looks like the largest issue that people shared on this was reduced earned revenue due to program cancellations, and a smattering of affirmative responses on the other options. Here's what the survey found back in September. And so here's the biggest impact that folks were talking about in the survey was canceled fundraisers. All right. So another question that the Pulse survey asked was around the kind of scale of your normal programming that you've been able to deliver during the pandemic. So Monica, if you could start this poll. So has your programming gone up or down, or have you actually ceased or put a pause on programs during the pandemic? Okay, and we'll leave this open for 5 more seconds. Okay, last couple answers. Okay. So it looks like most folks here have been able to operate, but at a moderately reduced capacity, but then a good number of folks have severely reduced. And then the next largest group is actually delivering more services. I think this is really consistent with what we've seen up here in Boston, and based on the Pulse survey, it sounds like most like you guys, most people have been moderately reduced or severely reduced, and then a good number of people are delivering more services.
And Julie, this is Mary. I'm just thinking that this is probably a reflection of who's in the room in terms of the type of organization, since we have a number of arts organizations that may be moderately to severely, as well as human service, which may have had to bump up. Yep,
exactly. And I think the Pulse survey too had a mix of areas that it was covering. All right. So our penultimate question, so what are the challenges that you're facing during this time? So Monica, if you could start this poll. Another 5 seconds. Okay, I'm gonna end the poll. Great, and so it looks like staffing actually is the largest concern. That's interesting. And I'd be interested to know Is this around having staff, hiring staff to fill positions, or concerns with your staff? If you want to place in the chat what you mean by staffing, I'd be interested to know more about that. See what people have been saying here. God, if I could see the chat, that would be great. Mary, you seeing things?
Yeah, it's hiring, recruitment, and retention. Someone is saying that financial concerns do exist, but none of that matters without the staff. So I'm sure for some organizations, maybe like the arts, you had to lay off. Now you're trying to bring people back.
Yeah, trying to get people back.
Right.
Awesome. Okay, and so what were people thinking back in June? It was mostly about figuring out how to reopen, and then the financials, and to a less extent the other things. I think this is just a reflection of where we are in time post-pandemic. And finally, kind of my last question to get us to the main event here. So what activities are you likely to undertake in the next 3 to 6 months? Monica, if you could start the poll. So here I gave some options. Well, I used the options from the survey, but it mostly clustered around planning, program development, and some discussions about equity issues. I'm curious to see what your kind of top thing are you going to be working on over the next few months. Okay, and we'll leave the poll open for another 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. And it looks like people are, the most common response was around program development, and then we had a good 40, almost 50% of people looking at some sort of planning, which makes sense since you're here. Okay, and what did folks say in the survey? It was mostly around program development, and then thinking about risk. Okay, ooh, I see why I couldn't see the chat, goes right under the poll. All right, so, you know, a lot of people at the beginning of the pandemic were thinking why we shouldn't plan now, we need to put it off. I would argue that it is a great time to do planning. It's kind of, this is the time where the rubber is really hitting the road, and making decisions about what is core to your organization is one of the key things that you can do now. It's interesting, some of the organizations that we've been working with said they had been through crises in the past, so they had already had that conversation. And so they kind of really went into the pandemic prepared, because they had already decided amongst themselves what was core. If you haven't had that conversation, now is the time. And so to understand what level of resource you need to conserve what your core is. So don't cut too little, but also don't cut too much to really cut into the bone. And it's a great way to screen to what opportunities that you should pursue. And then deciding after the fact, so what pandemic related stuff, was this just a one-time only kind of thing, or is this something that we actually want to retain because it's enhancing to our core? I think it's also planning during this time has been a great way to communicate with supporters like the Hartford Foundation. So here's what we're going to do to get through this, and here's our case for giving us the funds to be able to do that. But on the other hand, there's no need for overkill. So getting down to the last penny of what it might cost to do this or that, that's not what's kind of called for here. So this is not a time for rotation, but a time for just making some quick determinations about what's your core, how much that resource you need for that, and then kind of making decisions and moving on. All right, so scenario planning, what is this? And I like to think about this as an articulation of possible choices and outcomes given different parameters at hand. So the thing about what's going on right now is some of the stuff is in your control. A lot of it is not in your control. And so that's the time where you can kind of be paralyzed by the possible, things that could be coming your way. And so scenario planning is a time where you think about those external conditions and think about, okay, so how bad could it get? What's my best case here? And just kind of putting some stakes in the ground about what those things might mean. And then thinking about as that worst case or the best case happens, what would you do in response to that worst case or the best case? All of that should be, especially the choice-making part, should be grounded in your shared guiding principles. And here I'd say it's best to focus on, the coming kind of year to 18 months rather than trying to project out way into the future, because it just starts, you get diminishing returns at a certain point when there's so much uncertainty. All right. And so what are the factors? So the guiding principles. And so to you, this might sound like core values, the core needs of your beneficiaries, what are your core programs? So what makes you you? I think is what that core guiding principles piece is about. External uncertainties. Here are the places you don't have control over this stuff. So it could be the public health conditions. It could be demand after. So I know for the arts, this is a huge question. So once we're able to open up a theater, are people actually going to come back? Don't know. And then philanthropic priorities. I think there's a lot of foundations out there that are changing in what they're prioritizing, what they're going to be prioritizing over the coming few years. And so that's a big uncertainty. And then your response. So given those potential external factors, how would you respond to that with your program mix, with your staffing levels? So is this a time to reallocate your staffing? And then your infrastructure mix. So how much administrative overhead do you need to cover these things? Do you need the same amount of space? So those are potential organizational responses. And finally, doing some kind of quantification, both financial and non-financial, and thinking about the implications so you can actually make a decision. So this is a framework we're going to be kind of following throughout this workshop. And then what's the process you go through to kind of fill in those boxes for yourself? And we kind of thought about it as a 6-step process where you're kind of taking on each of those chunks one by one, and I'll walk through those with you through a case. Okay, so our case is the Hartford Chinese Youth Services, an organization I just made up. So HCYS, based loosely on some clients I've had in the past. So it's a youth development organization serving predominantly Chinese American youth. It rents a 5,000 square foot space, and its current program mix is a daycare program for infants and toddlers, after school for elementary and middle school students, and workforce development and cultural programs for teens. The annual budget right now is $3 million. So, and it entered fiscal 22 with $800,000 in cash. I'd say, that poll was interesting because it really looked to the negative on a lot of the financial pieces. And what we found with our clients is that a lot of folks actually came out of this year looking pretty good because of PPP and other kind of pandemic related relief. And so these folks got that stuff. And so they've got a nice kind of kitty of cash here. All right. So the guiding principles, what kind of questions might you ask yourself? And I often think about this, any kind of planning in the form of kind of a question. So what questions do I have to answer to get my plan? So guiding principles, some of the key questions are, so who am I responsible to, and what do they need? What about my partners? So what are my key partners in the community, and what is my responsibility to them? So what commitments have I made to equity and justice? And how will I preserve these things? I think with any kind of equity initiatives that organizations have made, those often are in the chopping block to be the first things that go. And I think it's good to ask yourself this question so that if it's like a last one in, first one out kind of question, if it's a new initiative, maybe now is the time to ask. So should we take that stance, or is this something that we want to preserve? And then strategy. So the pandemic really interrupted a lot of people in the middle of some strategy that you were already pursuing at that time. And so kind of reassessing your plans for the future pre-pandemic and whether some of these things are critical to your organization or whether they were kind of leaps to a next level that maybe it would be best to defer at this point. Having that conversation with you and your board would be important at this point. And I think now is a great time also to ask, so looking at your mission, vision, and values, has the pandemic, and I'd also say the events of the summer with the racial justice uprisings, have any of that put some of pieces of your core kind of questioned in a good way? And is this a good time to reevaluate some of those things? And then another way to think about the core is, so in a world of trade-offs, so which of the stuff could we actually cut and still be ourselves? And which of these stuff, if we cut, would we be something else? All right. So that's the guiding principles, really the foundation of any decisions that you're making. So for HCYS, what they decided in my hypothetical world is cultural representation and an arts-infused learning approach to develop a youth voice. That really sits at the core of their philosophy around youth development, and that community building too, to support social emotional development of youth is a critical piece. And then family engagement, kind of thinking about that, that context that the youth sit within is also a key piece that they want to preserve. Okay, so setting the parameters. So this is really around the things that you have no control over, and just taking out some of the complexity of that so that you can actually make a decision. So this is not to say anyone has a crystal ball, but at least just to, using your best information, try to put some stakes in the ground about how bad could it get, and what's my best case here. So these external uncertainties might involve the public health conditions, the need and participation levels, timelines. So there might be some things where when are they going to let us reopen? Those kinds of questions that you might want to kind of do some what if thinking around. And then are there some unexpected factors that have suddenly emerged that we need to take into account? And here I'd say people sometimes gravitate toward, well, if it all went our way, we'd be fine. I think you need to look at this moment at the worst case kind of straight in the face. Not to say that it's gonna be terrible, but just to understand, so if it's gonna get that bad, where would that leave us? So do we have enough money in the reserves to kind of see us through the worst case? Or would we have to make some drastic decisions now in case that happened? So looking at the worst case before it happens, I think is always a good idea. And that I think is at the heart of scenario planning, to think about how bad it could be and what you would do. All right. So for our guys, public health is certainly an issue. So in terms of capacity limitations for their childcare programs and cleaning costs as well. A second piece is around client demand. And so childcare and after school programs, the demand has actually gone down during the pandemic since so many of their families, the parents have lost work. And so there's just been a loss of demand. And then finally, community issues. Something that came up over the last few months is the increase in anti-Asian hate incidents. And then, of course, the sharp rise in unemployment during the pandemic. So those are the external uncertainties that our guys are facing. And I'll pause there for questions. Anyone have anything that was not clear in the presentation thus far? All right, I'll keep going. So this point is identifying choices. So what might you do in response to those things that you identified? So this is a moment to think about programming mix. This is a moment to think about staffing and infrastructure. So how might you reallocate resources in your new programming mix in different scenarios? So for our case, what they have found is that their childcare and after-school programs have been reduced by about 50% due to the significant unemployment of parents from the pandemic. And so their teen director during this time developed an idea for a workforce development program for parents, training them to start family childcare programs. And they also were realizing that they were having a hard time competing against family childcare anyway, since it's just a more affordable choice. And so this may be a direction that they wanted to go down in the long term in any case, and really refocus their childcare operation more on preschool than on infant and toddler care. They think that after school has come back, after schools reopen and the economy returns, and their hope is to continue offering some virtual programming until the demand is back for free, kind of as a goodwill gesture and a supportive gesture toward their families and their community. So the big question at hand is whether they should reduce the staffing on the childcare operation because of some of these things. So is it going to be a short-term thing for the pandemic, or should they actually choose to switch the childcare operation? And it also means that they may have some more space openings in the morning in their space if they reduce the infant and toddler care. So some longer term new program ideas that folks have had were around a potential partnership with a local community college to take on some of that space, maybe get some rental income. Thinking about potential for additional workforce development for parents or other adults in the community could be something that they take on. Mental health support is something that has come up because of the pandemic and anti-Asian sentiments. And then thinking about community engaged art projects, thinking about their youth voice kind of value, that this may be a way that they give their teens and youth a way to respond. And then people in the organization have been thinking a lot about collaboration with other BIPOC community organizations. So here are some of the choices that they have that they want to consider in this planning effort. All right, so just to kind of encapsulate all of that, so some of the choices are reduced scale in the childcare combined with a workforce development, reduced scale in the after-school program, but maybe that's a short-term thing, this teen artist project and anti-Asian hate, and then what's the operational choice here is potentially reducing staff in the daycare operation. Okay, so now that we've kind of thought conceptually about what the uncertainties are and how we might respond, the next piece is, putting pencil to paper or mouse to Excel and coming up with the financial implications. And so here's where you ask yourself questions around the budget and operations. What are some one-time investments? So especially with new programs, you may need to put some money in for new stuff, whether it be space fixes or curriculum or things like that. What about cash flow? So do you have the cash now to do these things, or would you have to raise money to do it? If we're thinking that some revenue is going to go down, when is that going to hit us? So thinking about contributed revenue. So are there some implications on contributed revenue for these programmatic choices? Could you actually raise money for some of these things, and how long would that take you? And then ultimately, so how much cash am I going to have left after I do all of this stuff? And do I have enough in the bank to kind of sustain myself over this time? So those are all the kinds of questions that you might be considering as you do the financial piece. So here I tried to summarize in kind of a one-shot some of the potential financial implications for our case. And here I kind of took it on a program by program basis. So on the daycare, we know it's 50% down. We also know that the grants to this may be reduced over time. And do we have to consider layoffs? And here I've kind of shown, so the earned revenue is, we think, going to hold steady at the 50% of 200,000, but contributions, we're not sure. And on the expense side, if we keep all the staff, we'll be at 768. But if we reduce staff to kind of match demand, but do the hard thing about laying people off, then we'd be down to under 500K in expenses. And it kind of went down the line for each of these programs. So for workforce, this would be a new thing. We could seek a grant for this, and we could get in some funds to cover our expenses. We might not get it though. We also are going to need to invest some money for a curriculum, and on down the line through after school, teens, this new public art program, and then this idea about renting space to community college. We'd have to put some money in to rehab. If we got it, we could potentially get this 100K toward our earned revenue, and that would cover our costs for maintaining that space. Just to show you, I'm going to attempt to switch my screen share. Kind of how this looks in Excel. I did create, it'll take a moment to snap in, a little mini model to show this. And so you can see here the same stuff that was on the slide. And so here's the total budget. And then I've broken that out into the different programs that we just talked about. And then here's overhead by itself. And you can see the starting and ending cash here. So this is budget, and here's our model, which we can switch up using these kind of toggles over here. So I've isolated all the risk factors and our assumptions about high and low into this little options worksheet, and then hooked it all up so that it changes the yellow boxes in here. And so you can download a copy of this. The Hartford Foundation will send you a link, and it's just, you know, it's a simplified way of thinking about all the different options, but I've just found, even as a discussion tool, it really lets you see, you know, opens things up for you and your board to have a conversation about the what ifs. And it also, I don't know about you, but I'm not great at doing math in my head. So especially when there's so many moving parts like this, and then being able to see the collective implication of these various, often unrelated uncertainties, and seeing, so where am I going to end up with the cash? Is this going to be a zero, a negative, God forbid? And it just kind of lets you see some of that complexity.
Hey, Julie,
cut through some of the complexity. Yes.
Quick question in the chat is, where is the overhead line?
Oh, yes. Here, I'm sorry. I ended my screen share too quickly. So this is, was this your question? So this is overhead. So this is basically all your unrestricted giving, and then admin related staff, occupancy, and other expenses, and the development. I stuck development under overhead. You know, you can go crazy with these models, of course, and take development out and have it be its own thing. And this is a fairly kind of simplified version that I made up for today. But, you know, I see some of my colleagues here. My colleague Jennifer Martin is sitting right here, and she has seen the crazy complexities that can go into model making. But at this point, and for the current moment, I kind of feel like simple is better. And let's just get a sense of the big moving pieces to see where we think that might leave us. Did I answer the question about overhead? Okay.
I think so. If not, Francine, you can put it in the chat.
Great. Okay. So I'm going to stop the share and go back to my presentation.
Julie, there is one other question in the chat that just popped up, which is, what is the difference between individual and contributions?
I think I had, just remind myself. I think those are the same. Oh, well, I was using the word contributions to refer to any contributed revenue. So that would include grants. And individuals, just donations from individuals. And then I had, I think, a line for institutional, and that would be grants from foundations. Okay. All right, so let's go back to the presentation, right? So we did that one. Here's a moment where you may be thinking about, so I've got some money in the bank, or I have a line of credit, and should I be deploying those things to do the things that I want to do? And we have a few rules of thumb at TDC when we make recommendations about this kind of question. So board designated reserves, we'd say try not to spend it down to zero. It's probably a good idea to maintain at least a month of unrestricted operating cash. And that you should think about maybe not your current reduced capacity if you've already done layoffs, but think about how big you want to be going forward and size your 1 month of working capital to that. Very good best practice not to include any deferred revenues in your working capital calculation. I mean, especially, I know in the arts, this is a kind of endemic issue of always using the future year's funds to cover working capital for this year. Now may be a difficult time to break that habit if that's one that you're in, but we recommend not including deferred revenue in that working capital calculation. So self-funding change capital, if you've got endowment at hand, now may be the time where it may be worth doing some trade-off on endowment draws to self-fund some change capital. Facility reserve is sometimes a pot of money that folks have if you've got a building. Should you dip into that? And here, it kind of goes back to your guiding principles conversation at the beginning. So is your facility core to who you are and the programs that you put forth? And if the answer is no, it's not necessarily core, that maybe the facility reserve could be a place where you dip in. But if it is, maybe this is something that you want to preserve, especially if you think that it's going to be hard to raise those funds going forward to meet any kind of building renewal needs. And then debt. So I think what we like to recommend is if you've got long-term debt with low rates, i.e. EIDL or PPP, and that may be forgiven anyway, go for it. A line of credit. So here, I think the thing that we always are sad to see is when there's an evergreen line of credit on someone's balance sheet. And if you really have no idea where the money's going to come from to clear that line of credit, then we'd say no, not a good use of debt. And then if there were a number of folks who were in the midst of a capital campaign, and should you dip into those funds? And I would say here, yeah, I mean, especially if the reason that you were going out for capital funds is somewhat obviated by the pandemic, then if those funds are unrestricted, then I think those are funds that are up for grabs. And this may even be a moment where you open a conversation up with the donor about, if they were restricted, about kind of releasing you from those restrictions. All right. So for our case, I think what we found is there is a potential need for $250K in a loan or a cost reduction. I think mostly because of their big payroll for the daycare program. Okay, so assessing the scenario. So now you've done all the work in the Excel. Let's kind of see all these things side by side and make a decision about the things that we have control over, which is the program and your staffing. So what are the financial risks? How do these things stack up in terms of the guiding principles? And then are you set up for sustainability going forward? Those are the key questions you should be asking yourself at this point. Okay. So looking back at the spreadsheet, as you saw, I had a number of places where there could be moves. This one I saw as the worst case scenario. So this is the world where you've got, you have not made the staffing reduction. You did not see bumps up in grants for any of the new programs. You did not get a renter for the extra space. And here's where you see the negative 250. So you've blown through all of your cash and you've gotten to a place of negative dollars. So not a great place to be. And probably not one where you as a director or the board could countenance preserving this with this possibility, all on the backs of maybe getting some grants to cover the cost of these new programs. So it would be sacrificing this or sacrificing the new programs. And even if you cut these, it wouldn't make up for all of this. Okay.
And Julie, there is a question in the chat from Anne, which says, for the line of credit, if the best time to apply for one is when you don't need it, does that impact the guidance on doing so?
On applying or drawing? So I guess that, so what I was talking about before was in terms of doing a draw on it. Applying for one, if you have not done this, definitely do this and get access to a line of credit. And having access to it is different from actually taking the money out. So if you don't have one, yes, please get one.
That's great, Julie, because yes, Anne clarified that she was asking about applying.
Yep, yeah, and if you are cash rich, potentially temporarily because of PPP and such things, now may be a great time to get access to a line of credit. So go for it, absolutely. But then think hard before you actually draw it down. But having it as a tool is useful. Okay. So here's our best case. So if everything goes your way on the contributed revenue for your new programs, you get your partner in here, and then you also reduce your staff on your daycare, you actually come out ahead and made money. Okay. And then the long run, I think for this one, I probably took out some of the one-times and then thought a little bit about where institutional grants might end up on your daycare. I always think on a scenario plan, so we can get some, specificity for the coming couple of years because we know more about what might happen in the coming couple of years. But I also want to see, is it possible for us to get to a bottom line of not negative for the long term. And so at least like, putting down something on paper like this, where I could look myself in the mirror and I could look my board in the eye and say, I think this is what the long run could be, and it's not zero or it's not negative. I think it's a critical thing. And I kind of feel like if you're doing your scenario planning and you cannot come up with a long run picture that is above zero, then your work is not done, and you need to keep at it until you can come up with something that's credible and that gets you above zero for the long run. Okay. And then, so in addition to the financials, which often draw the attention of yourselves as the board in particular, your staff and you, I think it's your job too to remind the board about the non-financial benefits of doing the things that you might be wanting to do. So are you addressing key needs in the community? Are you addressing partners' needs through your actions? So are there some other kinds of benefits that are not financial that are accruing? And then are there things that are kind of helping us get at guiding principles? So in the case of our case, thinking about the family engagement and cultural representation are things that I think our choices kind of represent. Okay. So the financial results. So in the worst case, these guys would have to take on debt or reduce the daycare staff to meet their cash needs. And in the long run, they may need to reduce the daycare staff anyway, or find another revenue stream to get to better than break even. And so here the question for you is, so do the intangible benefits merit the risk of financial loss? So is it worth it for you to keep those daycare staff on because you're, maintaining employment in the community or meeting some other guiding principle, and it just means that you're going to have to work harder to fill the gap, the potential gap, or is it really not worth it? So, and here's where you might want to ask yourself some other questions. So going back to the drawing board on your scenarios, and is there something, a better kind of mix that we could come up with that's going to kind of meet the needs? So is there some other programmatic option that would result in a smaller net loss? Are there other options where you might face the same financial issue, but be even better at meeting the guiding principles? So are there, or is it better just not to take on the new programs? I guess these are the questions. Once you do the financial exercise, you come up with a negative. So what do we do? Is it worth it? Or do we need to go back to the drawing board and come up with new scenarios? Okay. Yeah, I think I just ran through some of this. But you can almost think of this sheet almost like as a worksheet. So what are the questions I might ask of a new program to see whether it's worth it? So what are the costs, the one-times and the ongoing? How is this going to implicate my other programs? So am I going to be drawing attention and resource away from other things, or is this its own standalone thing? And then the benefits, of course, both financial and non-financial, and taken together, is it worth it? Is it worth it? Okay. All right, so our kind of fully completed case, we've nailed down the guiding principles. We have put some shape and stakes in the ground about the external uncertainties to reduce the complexity of dealing with those things. And I think making them less scary if you kind of looked it in the face and said, here's how bad it could be. And then considered the organization's response both in terms of program and staff capacity, and then thought through the implications. So in the worst case, we might be in a place where we're $250,000 in the hole. Could we deal with that? And is it worth it on the non-financial? All right. So after you've made the assessments and kind of made your decisions, then the last step, which is critical, is tracking. So if we thought those things when we made the decisions, definitely write down what you thought, and then have a mechanism to track your results against what you had thought. And so a couple of tools that organizations can use to do the tracking. So the first is cash flow analysis. The Nonprofit Finance Fund actually has a great tool for doing cash flow analysis. So if you have not done this or seen this, I'll send out a link to Betsy and Monica to post onto the website toward this. But it's just a way of really keeping track of when money is coming and when money is going out, so you know exactly when those things are happening. For our guys, and in the case, less of a huge issue because they have a pretty hefty reserve in the bank, but especially if you're at a point where you're really kind of draining to the bottom of the bank account at certain points in the month, it's critical. And then quarterly projections. So, you know, in normal times, we can set a budget annually and then kind of reassess on an annual basis. In these crazy times where we don't know what's going to hit us, you know, from day to day, it almost feels like really doing your projected year end, at least on a quarterly basis, is critical, I would say. And so here's where, especially if there are timing issues involved, like when are they going to let us reopen at certain amounts of capacity, then seeing where the timing is going to hit on the cash flow and on the quarterly projection be important. Okay, and here's where it's a good thing to have a conversation with the board about who's responsible for all this. And I really think that it's a joint enterprise between staff and board, where the board members should have should be a part of the discussion, since they are often the stand-in for the community in this conversation. So have a say in, or have a voice in talking about the guiding principles and setting the parameters on the uncertainties. And I think then it's the staff's job to then think about the choice making. So what's the program mix? What's our staffing mix? And it's your job to think in more specifics around the responses to the principles and the parameters. Assessing and monitoring risk and tracking those results, that really is a key responsibility of the board. So if they put this all onto your shoulders as the executive, I would push back and say, you know, you need to keep track of this as well. And I might give you the data, but we need to have a conversation about this on a pretty regular basis, especially if we're heading into uncharted territory with new programs and the crazy market that we're all working within right now. Say that long-term fidelity to the mission is also the responsibility of the board. So I think it's on the staff, on you as the executive, to articulate what the hard choices might be, but they need to make the decision about whether it's worth it for the organization to go on a different track or potentially, you know, make some refinements to the mission and the vision. And it's up to you to kind of first, I think, present some options, and then second, of course, to execute. So I think another great opportunity that scenario planning provides is to have an open conversation with funders and supporters. So, you know, it kind of shows that you've thought through all the hard questions. And once they ask their question, if you've gone through this process in a rigorous way, then you should have an answer. So you say, actually, yeah, we thought about that, and here are the reasons why we didn't think it was a good thing to go down that route, or, you know, or if it's a question around risk and a new direction that you're taking, say, well, we thought about that risk, and here's what we thought the worst case scenario was, and here's how we're going to respond to that. I think, so in addition to justifying your choices, another thing that scenario planning kind of lets you do is kind of fully kind of work out, what do you need, so that you don't, so your ask isn't too small. So what do you need to be able to respond to the current moment and the community's need? And if you've kind of gone through this process, then I think you would have worked out. So I need these kind of one-time investments. Here's what I think this is going to mean for my ongoing operating budget. So where you might have asked for 1x in the past, maybe it's actually more like 2x or 1.5x that you should have been asking for. And hopefully this process would have uncovered that, so that you don't miss size your grant. Okay, so I'm going to pause there. So that was our kind of rundown on scenario planning. And I wonder if folks have any questions before we dive into our last little bit here. And Mary, I somehow lost the chat window. Again.
Nothing in the chat at the moment, Julie, but if anyone has questions, please, this is your opportunity. Feel free to enter them in the chat.
All right. So, okay. So folks have been talking about reimagining a lot now, and I think this is a great time for reimagining for the nonprofit sector. And so why? And there's some kind of trends and kind of long-standing issues with nonprofits that we at TBC have observed. And so the one is around undercapitalization. So organizations in general lack the cash to manage and take risks, and their business models kind of inherently aren't adequate to support and sustain your mission delivery. And I think a lot of people did get kind of a leg up with PPP. And we've also been hearing about people who had grants suddenly unrestricted. I think a lot of foundations took this moment as a time to say, you know what, we gave you a grant for that thing. You may not be able to do that, but just keep the money. And that kind of freedom to make choices with your cash, I think for some folks has been kind of a life-changing moment. Like, wow, I was able to, for the first time, actually have a conversation with my staff that was not about what, you know, the grant said that we had to do, and it was more about what does our community need, and how can we deploy this cash. And I think once, if you've tasted that for the first time during this period, talking about the incredible impact of that kind of conversation with your staff and your ultimately your clients with funders, I think is an incredible moment. And so that is one piece. And another piece is around prioritizing service or program expansion rather than overall organizational health. So this may have been a moment where you actually paid people at kind of a more adequate fashion than you may have been able to in the past. And thinking about that kind of organizational health piece rather than just adding on more different programs or more programs, I think is a conversation that organizations should have with themselves and with their funders. Sweat equity. yeah, we heard from some organizations, wow, the PPP was the first time where I actually had enough funds to actually pay myself. And especially for organizations on the smaller end of the spectrum, I'd say in my experience working with BIPOC arts organizations, often with Black-led organizations specifically, people are working for free out there, and there are consequences for that kind of reliance on sweat equity, and having a conversation both in the organization and with the organization's funders about that issue, which is often invisible on the books. Sometimes people take the time to put in the in-kind donation for their labor, but oftentimes they don't. And I think now is a great time to have a conversation about sweat equity, especially for organizations where there's a kind of long-term expectation in the community that that program will be there, but people don't quite understand that it's being done on the backs of someone doing it for free. And now maybe a great time to have a conversation about that. Maybe that's not sustainable. Another big one is organizations who aren't reflecting the communities that they wish to serve. And now I think is a great moment where you've got the ear of funders and philanthropists who are interested in addressing this issue. So this is a great time to re-mention that piece. Yeah, so how do we use this crazy pandemic moment to address these issues? And, is this a time where you kind of think in your organization about, having a core focus on guiding principles and on, what does really sustainability really look like? Is this a moment where you could actually open that conversation with funders, where people have been kind of, jarred into thinking of taking a different viewpoint on these issues than they have in the past. All right, so that's my presentation. I'm posting my email address, so if you've got any kind of specific questions about your organization that you'd like to talk about, I'd love to do that. We'll have a Q&A session right now, and we'll have some time afterwards if you've got some questions that are particular to your organization that you'd like to ask. So I'm going to stop sharing. All right. And see whether folks have some questions. Oh, I see some questions. Oh, wait, okay, no, I answered those questions. So do folks have any questions or any comments about your kind of specific situation and what kind of scenarios that you're contemplating? Well, maybe I've got a question then. So are any of you contemplating starting up new programs or trying to make a decision about new things you started up during the pandemic and whether you're going to continue for the long run? Is that a question that any of you are considering?
Sorry, I couldn't get myself off mute. There are a lot of people who would like to mute me, and I just did it to myself. What I really appreciate about, and this is for me, your presentation is that my organization is just about to vote on a brand new strategic plan, and so much of what you brought to the table today will be incredibly useful in informing how we implement it, because it's essentially a strategic plan that is a needs assessment to gauge where we are and what we do and what else is needed in the community. So this This has really, really been helpful. And in answer to your just asked question, I will say one thing that we've learned is that we don't have the capacity we need. And we have to figure out how to grow into that. And so this today was very, very helpful for that as well. Thank you.
That's great. One thing I didn't mention that I think is always something that comes up during these things, especially in a situation where you don't have the capacity, is around phasing. So it may not necessarily be making the choice to cut a thing, but it may be making the choice to say, here's what the core is, and here's how we're going to expand from the core over time. And so, if there's a whole bunch of needs that you're trying to consider, thinking about the sequencing of, so this year we're going to tackle this thing, next year we're going to add on that thing, the third year we're going to add on this other thing, maybe a way that you want to think about it. I see some questions coming up in the chat.
Yeah, there's a question from Carol that says, could you please talk a bit about the application of BIPOC in planning programs?
Carol, can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by this question? So what do you mean by application of BIPOC?
Carol,
if you're talking, you're muted.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me now? Yeah,
yes.
We're planning for a summer program with youth this summer. And
yep.
want to incorporate the whole idea of the youth voices in planning programs. So that's what I need to get a sense of what's appropriate with youth, children and youth. Yeah.
I think that it is important to get the voice of youth into a program planning process. It's funny. I've worked with youth serving organizations, many of which have said this, but I don't know that I've seen it up close and personal, someone who's doing it well. But I think my intuition is, I think, or one thing that folks often talk about is having youth join some kind of governance function. So whether it be a youth-focused advisory council or some youth joining a board. So giving youth a voice at the table, I think, is important. And then I think, and I've done this to greater or lesser success, but doing survey work or focus groups with youth to, start them talking about what their preferences are. And I think is another way to kind of get the youth voice in there. Does that help answer your question, Carol?
Yes, it does. I like the idea mentioned about a focus group to listen to what youth have to say. Yeah, so I'm thinking that would be a key part of our planning, to listen to their voices before we deliver a program and it's not applicable for what they start thinking about. Yeah. And
I think it's important who does it. I actually did a focus group a couple of times with a group of 8th graders. Did not go well because they didn't know me. I kind of dropped in out of the sky, and they're funny. Like, they know what the quote unquote right answer is, and they on purpose gave me the wrong answer. So in answer to questions like, so what do you find helpful about this after school program? They said right into my face, like, it keeps me off the streets and not taking drugs. So I think that having the right person to do the focus group, someone they know and they trust, is important. So bringing the consultant in from outside, unless they're, I don't know, I was not the right person to do it.
I see. Yes. So, well, what you said is key, and I appreciate that.
Yeah.
You've got to have the right person, because otherwise the youth will just not take it serious or very critical. Yes.
Yeah, they are. I think youth, and I have a teenager myself, and they know what the right answer is, and they
Yes.
know what people are expecting them to say, and they will often try to subvert that. So, yeah.
Well,
But if your organization is doing its job, then there are adults there who they have close relationships with, and know that those adults kind of have their best interest at heart. And I think the most important thing when dealing with youth is to somehow get across that you actually want to hear what they have to say, and you're not
right.
looking for the right answer. Yeah.
Yes. That's very helpful. Thanks for sharing that.
Sure.
Yeah.
And
Thanks for asking the question.
Julie, there is another question from Robin in the chat that says, you spoke about assessing potential participation in your organization or demand for your services. Please talk about how you make this assessment. Surveys?
Yes. Yep. Definitely surveys. And so I think you can go about it from top down and bottom up. So I think from the top down perspective, it's just doing some basic look at census data to understand, so how many people actually are there who could be doing the thing that you want. So giving you a sense of kind of the upper limits, and then to do some survey work. And the thing I like about, I think that a multi-method approach is useful for when talking to your clients. So you may want to do, the sequence I often think about is doing some interviews first, to understand kind of what are the major issues that are on the minds of customers, and then doing some survey work to interrogate some of those questions, and then doing focus groups afterwards when you've got the survey results in hand to get more at what did you mean by this? So here's the response that we got, and what, help me understand what this actually means. So doing kind of a multi-step process like that is one that I find helpful. Any other questions? Yeah, anyone have a big decision that they're trying to make right now? Well, I'll say thank you to Venton Forbes for your nice comment. You said that the presentation is you said the presentation was timely. What do you mean by that?
We're also doing a strategic plan, and also looking at transition within the organization of leadership and potentially new roles. So really doing the assessment that you spoke about to see, are the work that we're doing still relevant? Are we still serving the need of the community? Or are there opportunities to bring on new staff to address these new issues that may unfold?
Great. So what are the, and in terms of the new staff, is this around capacity expansion or around different skills that you need on staff?
Capacity. Basically, I'm the only full-time employee right now, so looking to break up
my
some of my
gosh.
responsibilities.
Yeah. Yep. And how many folks do you serve with your, what kind of organization is it? How many folks do you serve?
I oversee two different organizations. One is a preventive healthcare. We do quality healthcare locally and internationally. So locally, we serve average around 300 patients for preventive healthcare service for screening, chronic health issues, and then internationally serve about 12,000 a year. And then the other organization is more education and human services, and we serve probably around 2,000 individuals through programs and activities.
And you said you're the only full-time staff person?
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, you need more capacity. I give you that advice for free.
And Julie, I know we had said, we are going to shift to after class time, but I think we're a small enough group where I think this is after class time at this point.
Yeah, I think so.
If
Yeah.
folks have any other questions for Julie, you have access to her for a few minutes. If there's anything you want to bounce off of her, this is your last chance. Please feel free to do so.
Yeah, free advice. Should we stop the recording now?
Sure.
There's challenges and opportunities around our performance.